The goal here is not to deport one student or another student who may or may have said something. The goal here is to quash criticism of Israel. This phase is a deliberate campaign of repression, fear, intimidation, some would say really an environment of terrorism. The vast majority of Americans, probably nearly all Americans, have never experienced this kind of political repression in their life. U.S. foreign policy is the least democratic of all policies, being bribed and corrupted every day by AIPAC, by Saudi, by Azerbaijan, by Turkey, by, name the government. Whoever has 10 cents to rub together is spending it to corrupt American government, some legally, some illegally. The Democratic Party chose to lose the election rather than lose its pro-Israel donors. And that is the, goal of the pro-Israel lobby, which is they've lost the war of ideas. They've lost the support of the vast majority of people around the world. They've lost that battle of ideas. And that's why they're now resorting to brute repression.
Yeah.
Here's Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute. The TurkishMinute.com.
I have here today with me the executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, Sarah Leah Whitson. Hello, Sarah. We spoke last
there.
week.
Thanks
And
for having
you told me then Israel's actions in Gaza qualified as genocide. And since then, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch agreed, and ICC issued arrest warrants in November for the Israeli leaders, and ICJ case is continuing. But every day we are waking up to another atrocity in Gaza. More than 50,000 people are dead, and the living conditions are horrid, and it's continuing. And now it seems Israeli leaders and the US government is saying the quiet part out loud, and they're saying they're planning to cleanse Gaza of its inhabitants. And now we are entering a new phase as well in the US. Those who speak up against this genocide are being punished. Now, especially those who can be targeted via administrative means, immigrants, students, those who are staying in the US via a visa. The specific case I wanted to talk to you about is the case of Rümeysa Öztürk. She's a PhD student at Tufts University. And last year she wrote an op-ed, an opinion piece in which she criticized the university administration for its response to the protests against Israel's military campaign. And this op-ed is the only piece of activism Rümeysa Öztürk engaged in. And yet this activism landed her in detention. In March, ICE agents grabbed her off the street, masked ICE agents, plainclothes masked ICE agents, grabbed her off the street and swept her to an ICE detention center where she remains in harsh conditions. She has asthma, and she says she's denied even basic needs such as food sometimes. But today, this morning, Washington Post published a report about the case of Rümeysa Öztürk, and they've gotten their hands on some internal memos of the State Department and Department of Homeland Security. And their investigation found no evidence of activism of any kind that can pose a threat to U.S. national security or U.S. foreign interests. What's going on? Where are we right now? How would you describe the current phase?
This phase is a deliberate campaign of repression, fear, intimidation. Some would say really an environment of terrorism. These are political acts being directed, in some cases violent acts being directed against the civilian population, in this case the population in the United States, for their political beliefs and their political opinions. So it's also political persecution. The goal here is not to deport one student or another student who may or may have said something. The goal here is to quash criticism of Israel. The goal here is to create a climate of fear among every American, so that the logic is that if they can do this, to an immigrant, if they can do this to a foreign student visa holder, then, clearly the message is that nobody should talk this way. Because, the visa cancellations, the ICE detentions, that's a very prominent part of what the Trump administration is doing, but it's only a small part. It is accompanied by efforts to sanction, expel students, get people fired from jobs, make it impossible for people to get jobs. Just raising the costs, raising the punishments for talking about Palestine or even associating with people who talk about Palestine. I would venture to guess that the vast majority of Americans, probably nearly all Americans, have never experienced this kind of political repression in their life. People in Turkey, people in the Middle East, people in Russia, people in China, they understand what's happening in the United States very, very clearly because they have lived in an environment of political repression where there are some things you may not talk about. And if you dare to talk about them, you will end up in prison. You will end up punished in every way imaginable. But in the United States, people are not used to this. So it is also very much part of the shock and awe approach. The other thing I would say is that this is starting about Palestine, and the main goal is to silence people about Palestine. And the Trump administration is catering to a very small group of pro-Israel donors, pro-Israel political groups like AIPAC. But it's not going to end with Israel. Once they have penetrated the sanctity of the university, once they have violated the sanctity of our free speech rights enshrined in the Constitution, then no one's speech is safe, and they will continue to silence other speech. And that's already happening, of course, with all of this attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, for example, a private law firm that had a group within the law firm working on women's health regulatory issues, a Women's Health Regulatory Committee, has just changed its name. It's dropped out the word women, because even having a group or a committee that's focused on women is something that they're afraid is going to get them into trouble with the Trump administration.
Your work was focusing on especially the US support for the authoritarian regimes and human rights violations in the Middle East, for the audience to understand. I think your work is very grounded, that aims for tangible, concrete change that can happen when you have a global superpower like the US, which does what it does and controls certain spheres of influence. You have a very, environment susceptible for influence for the positive as well, because there are people chafing under the boots of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, and their lives can improve by your work if you can get to influence the decision makers not to take certain decisions. And you've been working on this for a while. What your work was against is coming home to the United States. The title of your organization is Democracy for the Arab World Now. What is your organization doing in the face of democracy being lost in your home country? Yeah.
We're really only using the name Dawn now. We're not using all of those words, particularly because the very word Arab world is exclusionary for some people. There are people who are like, well, we're not Arabs, but we're in the Middle East. So, so we're going by Dawn, and that is a product of reflection on our own part about the work that we do. Since I took over Dawn in 2020, it's been very, very clear to me that our role and our purpose is to shape U.S. policy. That's where we have a responsibility, because we're Americans and we're not responsible for what the government of Russia does or the government of China does, or frankly, even what the governments in the Middle East do. we are responsible for what our own government does. So as a matter of responsibility and as a matter of effectiveness, we should be able to influence what our government does, since we supposedly still live in a democracy. In terms of efficacy, we think the best way to achieve our goals for democracy in the Middle East is to end support for authoritarian regimes. Now, what we have discovered, and what I've kind of long known, but it's become very crystallized in my work, is that US foreign policy is the least democratic of all policies. Of all the policies that the US government works on, whether it's the environment or the economy or education or health or whatever, those have a lot of democratic input. The American public is very engaged. They have their very own interests in how the US government handles these policies. It directly affects them. But on foreign policy, Americans are largely checked out. They don't seem to understand that it affects them. And the sphere is completely controlled by lobbying interests. That's domestic lobbying interests, principally the weapons industry, which wants to see American support for abusive regimes because it's very profitable when the number one weapons purchaser of American weapons is Saudi Arabia, and the number two is the UAE, and the number three is Egypt. Or if the US gifts its weapons, ultimately it's American companies that profit because Raytheon gets to send the gift, and the American government pays the bill to Raytheon to send $18 billion of weapons to Israel. And we also have foreign government interests that are very influential, starting, of course, with the Israeli government interests and those small group of very wealthy people who are aligned with the Israeli government here in the United States and lobby for Israel's interests ahead of everything else, as well as now the foreign governments lobbying directly and infiltrating our government themselves, like the Saudi and UAE and Gulf regimes. But really, all the regimes are in on the game. I mean, some of it do it more clumsily, like the Turkish government bribing New York City's mayor with a few upgrades and luxury hotels. Who knew it would be so cheap to buy an American mayor? They've discovered our cheapness. But our foreign policy in the United States is largely controlled by these interest groups that do not reflect the interests of the American people. And now we are seeing the ways in which they are undermining our own democracy, corrupting our democracy, making Americans lose faith in their elected leaders who they see being bribed and corrupted every day by AIPAC, by Saudi, by Azerbaijan, by Turkey, by, name the government. Whoever has 10 cents to rub together is spending it to corrupt American government, some legally, some illegally. And so that is what we're fighting, because we're also trying to preserve our own democracy, which is being undermined by U.S. foreign policy decisions, by U.S. foreign policy for sale, selling its foreign policy to its highest bidder. Even the Democratic Party chose to lose the election rather than lose its pro-Israel donors, choosing to stay on Israel's side, even though the vast majority of Democratic voters did not want these policies in support of Israel. But the Trump administration does it more nakedly, more openly, less apologetically, less secretly. So in that way, our work is obviously about shaping U.S. policy in the Middle East, but our work is also about preserving democracy, protecting American democracy, the integrity of the American democracy from these nefarious foreign lobbying interests.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. You said when they use an administrative power to revoke a visa, their main goal is to intimidate the people into submission with regards to Israel. I don't know if rights advocates in the US realize that this can also quickly escalate into detention of American citizens for their speech. And I checked earlier the process to denaturalize a naturalized citizen, a person who is not born in the US. There's a process that requires evidence of fraud and evidence that says you were not supposed to become citizen in the first place. Now, this reminded me of the case of Mahmoud Khalil, because Mahmoud Khalil was a permanent resident in the US, and they said he lost that right because of some 50s law that says you can't harm American foreign policy, you lie to us, etc., etc. And now one can easily see this turning into naturalized American citizens being denaturalized through judges. This can only be done by a federal judge, apparently, through judges appointed by the Department of Justice, and which is also appointed by Trump. How do you think the urgency of this matter is crystal clear for Americans? Do they clearly see what is at stake here?
No, I don't think that the vast majority of Americans understand the extent to which the attack on visa holders, the attack on green card holders, soon to be an attack on naturalized citizens, is an attack on all Americans, is an attack on really, I would say, the only thing that distinguishes the United States from autocracies and dictatorships around the world. The most important way that the United States is better than all of the autocracies around the world is with our freedom of speech. That is the one truly distinguishing feature why the United States is arguably a better place than Russia or China or name your country, Turkey.
Yeah.
And that is what is being attacked and eroded. The sort of opening salvo of going after Mahmoud Khalil, who is a green card holder, is very important to understand, is that it is basically a downgrade of the green card.
Yeah.
I think prior to this, the longstanding understanding assumption of immigrants in the United States is once you got your green card, you're safe. You're fine. You can travel, you can have a job, you have a legal right to live here permanently. That is what a green card is. It's a permanent residency card that you choose to convert into a citizenship or not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There are hundreds of thousands of green card holders who've never gotten citizenship, and they felt for whatever reason they don't need to or they don't want to. And now all of a sudden, that green card is no longer doesn't have the status and the protection that it used to have. So it's also deeply, deeply destabilizing. The threat to go after naturalized citizens, whether or not the courts approve it or agree it, or whether or not it goes through, the very threat that it might be something that the government does against a naturalized citizen is really, again, designed to instill fear and chill speech. And that, is already happening. When the Trump administration is demanding that Columbia turn over disciplinary records of students who've been disciplined or involved in disciplinary hearings in which they may have been found not guilty of any disciplinary violations or rules at Columbia University, that is a deliberate threat against all of the students of Columbia University, because these records would reveal the names of people involved in a group, the names of people's friends. Who did you organize with? When did you plan this? Who did you talk to? And so, again, it's about association and fear. And that is the goal of the pro-Israel lobby, which is they've lost the war of ideas. They've lost the support of the vast majority of people around the world who support Palestinian rights, and many countries have always supported Palestinian rights. In some countries, like the United States, are now tipped to the majority to support Palestine and to support Israel. They've lost that battle of ideas. And that's why they're now resorting to brute repression. To brute repression, even as Americans, some of these Americans supporting Israel and pushing for these repressive measures, even if it means their own freedom of speech is being denigrated and destroyed, ultimately, because it's something that erodes the protection of everyone, including themselves, their families, their children. They don't care, because all they want is to silence speech about Israel.
Yes, and I find it quite ironic, and I don't know if this gets to you sometimes. Political speech criticizing another country is being repressed. This also means that Israel's interests are so important for the US government, that it risks downgrading the standards in which their own constitution guarantees for its citizens, and for downgrading the US democracy in general. One can understand this if this was done even for the political benefit of one person. This has precedent. You can understand this, but this is happening to protect the genocidal war Israel is waging. This is a candid question. Doesn't this get to you in thinking about
it? Gets to me, and I've gone around saying this to people around the world who are just completely puzzled. How is it possible that the United States is hurting itself, hurting its own country, hurting its own freedoms in order to protect the interests of a tiny genocidal regime thousands of miles away? The puzzle is answerable if you start with the understanding that the American government, American policymakers are corrupted. They are corrupt. They are not acting in the interests of the American people. They are not acting in the interests of the American nation. They are acting in the interests of those who are funding their political party, funding their political campaigns, funding them individually to cater to Israel's interests. When you start with that understanding, it becomes clear how this is possible. The only people who are going to save American democracy are Americans themselves. We have hopes that the judiciary will do its job to protect the Constitution, to preserve the Constitution. But we are also seeing very dangerous signs that the Trump administration will attack the judiciary, will disobey the judiciary. They are already sort of floating, and you see Elon Musk tweeting about this. Why should judges get to be the bosses of the president? Only the president should be the boss of the president. Nobody should be the boss, which is so antithetical to the entire structure of the American government and why it is the longest lasting democracy in the world, which is the checks and balances, that our judiciary does have power over the executive branch. Our Congress does have power over the executive branch. So when we say that they are dismantling the entire system of the American government, not just freedom of speech, but the system of American government, again, in order to primarily, overwhelmingly protect Israel from criticism. The only way you can understand it is if you see the corruption of the executive branch, of the officials in the Defense Department, in the State Department, in Congress, who are beholden to people who are giving them money. It's as simple as that.
I see. And to wrap this up, I want to ask you, there's this bleak precedent set in other countries when administrations start to ignore judicial decisions and rulings of the judges. It also creates this environment where legal rulings do not matter, the word of the law do not matter unless you have power. And Trump is using his power now to supersede the American judiciary. Do you have any words to American people to overcome this? How can Americans stop this from happening?
I think that what we're discovering here is, what I call the 3 C's. We've become complacent. We take it for granted that American democracy will work on autopilot, that we don't have to do anything, and we get to live in a free and democratic society without any work, without any effort. It's our expectation that as citizens living here, even as immigrants living here, we get to be in a democracy. That complacency is misplaced. Every citizen has to fight for their democracy, has to work for their democracy, has to be involved in their democracy. And if you're not, and if you're complacent, this is the result. We have to overcome cowardice. That's the second C. We have to put our own skin in the game to defend our country, to defend our constitution, to defend our democracy. And we have to fight corruption. That's the third C. Because that corruption is what is eating away at our own country in so many different levels, but especially in terms of our foreign policy, a foreign policy that has literally destroyed the lives of 50,000 people in Gaza. That number, I'm sure, is at least actually 200,000. And I'm sure within a year, when people who have been injured succumb to their injuries, will exceed 300,000. But now is harming people in our country. Only reason that this country is better than other countries, and that's our freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Here's Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute.
Turkish Minute. The TurkishMinute.com